All right, let's continue our discussion of TPAC by looking specifically at Webquests. You've probably heard the term Webquests at some point in your educational past, but what exactly are they? Oftentimes, teachers think that anytime they set their students in front of a computer and give them internet resources, they're engaging in a Webquest. Well, that's not really the case, and it's certainly not the case for what we're trying to do in this class. The guy that created the term Webquest, his name was Bernie Dodge. He was a professor at San Diego State University, and he coined the term way back in 1995. He described it as an inquiry-oriented activity in which most or all the information used by learners is drawn from the internet. As you can see by the red font, the operative term here in the definition is inquiry. And that's what we're going to try to do in this class. We want to use the internet to get students to think in a disciplinary fashion about an issue that's important within that discipline. So for example, in social studies, we would want students to think historically or politically or economically. In mathematics, we'd want them to think mathematically. In biology or chemistry, we want them to think scientifically. So again, just giving students a bunch of websites does not automatically create a meaningful instructional activity. It's your job as the teacher to find good resources online and use them in a way to scaffold information for students so that they can answer the inquiry question that you pose. So before we talk about what characteristics of a good Webquest are, we want to talk a little bit about what bad Webquests are. Unfortunately, these examples of bad Webquests that I'm going to show you are typical of what I see when I go drop in on student teachers or their cooperating teachers and how teachers generally use technology in their classrooms. This first bad Webquest seems constructivist in nature. I'm going to give you a topic, then I'm going to send you out on the internet to find information about it. So I've given you an example here. Do a Google search on James Madison, and using the sites that you find, answer the following questions. When was he born? Where did he live? Things like that. So let's do that. So we go to Google, everyone's favorite search engine, and we'll type in James Madison. So a couple things that should pop up automatically for you, some red flags. The first thing that pops up, first two things actually that pop up, are ads. One is from civiced.org, which I actually happen to know is a decent one. The second one is libertyday.org, which I have absolutely no clue about. The important thing is that the first two hits that show up are advertisements. They want you to buy something from these websites. Now that in itself isn't bad, but it's problematic because research shows that students are not very good at discerning good information from bad information or legitimate websites from websites that are not legitimate or things that they're trying to get them to buy stuff on. And research also shows that students tend to go after the first hits on any sort of Google or Bing search. So the fact that the first two advertisements first two links are advertisements is problematic. Then you get down to the first one that's not an advertisement, which you're thinking, okay, great. But instead, it's Wikipedia. Now, you use Wikipedia, I use Wikipedia, everybody uses Wikipedia. Chances are this Wikipedia entry on James Madison is probably okay. However, we all know that for academic purposes, we should stay away from Wikipedia because people can go in and manipulate it. This becomes especially important for if students are looking up something contemporary or something controversial or political. People can go in there and change it at any given point to fit their own particular narrative. Now, the next three that I see, whitehouse.gov, history.com, and biography.com, are probably the legitimate websites that you can find decent information about James Madison. The last one on the first page that comes up, though, is James Madison University. Now, it's a great university. I went there. Go Dukes. But you'd be surprised that there's very little information about the man himself. So of this first page of results, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 results. I would argue that 4 of them are things that students shouldn't use in this particular project, which is problematic. Why else is this a bad Webquest? Well, first, the focus of the activity becomes searching for information rather than the information itself. So again, if you just give students a topic and send them to the vast terrain of the internet, they're going to spend time and be consumed with looking up the information and trying to figure out good sites or short sites or things that they can find the information quickly, and that shouldn't be the focus. And another thing that's important here is that the teacher is asking students to make judgments on which websites are good and which websites are bad, and students tend to do a very bad job at this. And as a general rule, you'll want to make these decisions for students. One, because it'll help them scaffold the inquiry that you're hopefully getting them to do. And two, it keeps them from stumbling on things that they shouldn't be on. The example I always like to give to students is way back when I was teaching high school, if you wanted to have students do research on the White House itself, and you gave them an activity like this, they might go in and search whitehouse.com because students don't necessarily understand that the White House would have a government or .gov website. So if they did that, at least back then, they would run into a politically themed porn site, and that's something that you, as a teacher, want to strive for. You don't want to have your students run into porn sites or other sites that could be morally objectionable. And that's a really good way to get parents and administrators mad at you. So you want to be in control of the website. And the activity's way too broad. There's probably millions of sites on James Madison that students could wander into. They need a little bit more direction. So let's look at a second bad web quest. So on this one, I give them the website and I tell them to go to this Holocaust timeline and do the following, answer certain questions. So I click this, and this is not a bad little website. It does give a pretty comprehensive timeline of the Holocaust, and some of these links will take you to primary source pictures and material that students could use. And if I go back to the questions, I've given them some targeted questions to go for and given them some decent direction. So I would argue that this web quest is better than the first one for the following reasons. The teacher's in control of the website. I knew the website was good, so I sent students there knowing that they aren't going to stumble into something they shouldn't be stumbling onto, and that it was a legitimate website. There was less emphasis on searching the web, so I gave them the website. They didn't have to search for the information. Some of the questions were analytical, even though most of the questions were, go to this particular date and click on the link. Why is this web quest still a poor use of technology? There really wasn't much there that's different than saying, turn to chapter 5 in the textbook that's on the Holocaust and answer the questions in the back, or read this particular passage. So when we're using the internet, especially in this class and in our classrooms, we want to make sure that we're using the internet different than a high-tech textbook. Okay, we want to make sure that the inquiry is three-dimensional. We want to make sure that students are using the internet to answer, problematic disciplinary questions that may arise, instead of just acquiring information. So what are some characteristics of a good web quest? Okay, again, the ultimate goal of the activity should be to use the internet to complete a task that results in a critical understanding of content. Most importantly, a good web quest is going to do the following. Maximize student engagement with content by minimizing time spent searching the internet. Remember, we don't want students to spend all their time looking for stuff. That is a skill. Being able to discern between good websites and bad websites is a skill that students need to learn. However, for this particular purpose, we want to focus more on the inquiry and the disciplinary aspect of it. Rely less on fact acquisition and more on critically analyzing content. And again, not using the internet as a high-tech textbook, but rather as a tool for answering a disciplinary inquiry. So I'm going to talk about the elements of a good web quest, and then I'm going to show you an example at the end. So the first step is the introduction to the web quest. And this is simply just laying out what the student should expect to get out of doing the web quest. It should grab the student's attention and get them interested in the topic. And it should explain the overarching goals that you're hoping to achieve, which is the inquiry. So it's going to clearly lay out the inquiry. And I can't emphasize how important this is, because students are unlikely to find something if they don't know they should be looking for it. So sometimes the inquiry is kind of embedded in a web quest, but it should be front and center. The inquiry should not be something that students have to guess at. All right? You should be on the beginning, giving them the question that you want them to answer by the end of the web quest. Step 2 is the student's task. What's the role that the student is going to play in the web quest? Are they pretending to be a scientist, or are they pretending to be a former president, that sort of thing? Explain the end product or the goal that the student's working towards. Are they going to be writing a letter to the president? Are they going to be engaging in a scientific experiment and seeing what happens? You know, this is your opportunity to be creative, and there's really no way to do this incorrectly as long as you let students know what exactly are they expected to do in this WebQuest. Step 3 is the meat of the WebQuest. This is where you are giving them the internet resources that they are going to use to complete the WebQuest. Okay? It's important that you give them links to the WebQuest so they're not searching for the information, and it should be clear to students how the websites progress on each other. Don't just give them a list of 10 websites and say, go for it. That's a little bit better than doing a Google search, but not much. Okay? And also, you have to keep in mind your students' attention spans and their reading abilities. So some websites can be 30 pages long. You probably don't want them to read all 30 pages. So if you just want them to read a section of a website, you want to hone them in on that particular section or subsections. Okay? And again, the activities should progress logically and build upon each other. The whole idea of this WebQuest is that you're using the internet to scaffold information so that students are looking at a issue or a question or a problem that they hadn't really thought much about before. They're finding information about it, and then they're answering an inquiry question. And the only way that they can answer that inquiry question is if you use the information on the internet to scaffold what they don't know to a point that they can make a reasonable judgment about it. Step 4 is the conclusion. This is where you tie everything together. This is where they kind of answer the inquiry. You tie what students did in step 3 with your larger goals and the inquiry that you presented in the introduction. It's not a recap. It's not just this is what we did. Instead, your conclusion should have them reflect and analyze on what they've done. In other words, answer the inquiry question. And then, of course, step 5, just like with any educational assignment, you're going to have to figure out, well, did they get it? You know, how am I going to know if they understood what we did in this WebQuest? And so you have to have some sort of activity that the students can turn in that you can figure out whether they gain the intended historical understanding or scientific understanding or mathematical understanding from the assignment. The evaluation should tie into the overarching aims found in the introduction and the conclusion. The evaluation should also answer the inquiry question. So if you pose the inquiry question at the beginning, you should answer it in the conclusion, and then they should, find a way to answer it in the evaluation so you could see whether they understood it. All right, so I'm going to give you an example. Obviously, this is one that I created for social studies. So, it's not going to look the same for math or science, but the same processes are there. So a couple things while this website's loading. You can see here that I use Weebly to create this. All right, Weebly's free. Other web creation software like Wix is free. And I found a couple little cool photographs that I could use to make this look a little bit nicer. When you're dealing with WebQuest, though, the appearance is not as important to me as the content. I used to use this same WebQuest. I actually created this WebQuest back when I was teaching high school, and this is before Weebly or Wix even existed. And I basically did it on a PowerPoint presentation. So the website wasn't anything special to look at, but the content was there, and so students really enjoyed it. But if you can make things look pretty, even better, all right? Because students are now, on their computers all the time. They expect a certain amount of, attention to graphics, and things like Weebly and Wix can make that very easy for you. So before I even get into it, I want to note a couple things. Navigation is huge, okay? You always want to make sure that you have a navigation bar somewhere. It could be up on the top, it could be on the side of the WebQuest, however works for you, so that students can quickly go to different sections of the WebQuest as they see fit. Also, it's nice for you to be able to have links within the WebQuest so they can move from one part of the WebQuest to the other. Okay, so notice I say here, there'll be a link at the bottom of each page that will allow you to move to the next section of the WebQuest, or you can use the navigational buttons at the top of the screen. And so we want to move to the introduction, so we click here. All right, so again, in the introduction, this is where I lay out what the students are going to be doing in the WebQuest and what the inquiry is going to be. So I'd say, in this web quest, you're going to learn about innovations during the Middle Ages. Specifically, you're going to be looking at how knights in the Middle Ages developed and used a weapon called a trebuchet to knock down castle walls. You'll learn about how trebuchets worked and even take a turn at trying to fire one yourself. The greater goal of this web quest is to gain an appreciation for scientific achievement in an era commonly referred to as the Dark Ages because of a general lack of written history and culture. Although the Middle Ages was an era dominated by war, we can see the same type of scientific spirit back then that we do today. Specifically, we will be exploring the question of whether we should consider the Dark Ages a period of scientific achievement. So there's my inquiry question right here. Specifically, we will be exploring the question of whether we should consider the Dark Ages a period of scientific achievement. Now, it's important to know that an inquiry question is something that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. Students could go either way with this, but the point is they're going to be able to answer this question by the end of the web quest. So I'm going to the next page here to see the task. So my task is, in this web quest, you're taking the role of a knight in the Middle Ages who is in charge of developing weapons for battle. You've been assigned to make a trebuchet, so you will look at how they are designed and what they're used for. You will then take your work out in the battlefield and attempt to knock down your enemy's castle. You'll need to be both smart and brave if you are to succeed. So again, just something to capture their attention and kind of put them within a context. The procedure is the nuts and bolts of the web quest. All right, so first thing I have them do is I want to let them see what a finished trebuchet looks like, so they kind of have a picture in their mind of what this is. So I've got just send them to a picture. Now, before I move on, notice that all of my links open up into new windows. That's important because students, we've all done this before. You click the little X, and then if it's not in a new window, you lose everything. You have to restart. So it's always important to open things in new windows. But this is an example of a trebuchet. So even without knowing what it is, you can see that there's probably something here, and it gets thrown this way. So number 2, now you need to know what a trebuchet is used for. Follow this link to a page devoted to the history of trebuchets. And then it's important to note that I say, first look at the section entitled Trebuchet History. So I'm not sending them to the full website, I'm telling them to look at a certain section. Then read the section Trebuchet Missiles. So 2 sections out of this web quest, and then I want them to find the answers to these questions here. So the link here, and so I just want them to look at trebuchet history. That gives them a little bit of the history of trebuchets and what they were used for, and what the trebuchet missiles were, things that they fired into castles, including dead animals, fire, things like that, not just cannonballs. All right. And then part 3, if you're going to make a good trebuchet, you're going to need to know a little bit about the science behind the weapon. First, take a look at the diagram at the top of this page, and I have them answer these questions. Now, this whole page is on the physics of the trebuchet, and this whole page is fairly complex, but I want them to just look at the diagram. Without knowing anything about the physics or anything about trebuchet, you can figure out what this kind of does based on your knowledge of a basic seesaw, right? So if somebody heavy here lands here, whatever's here is going to get flown this way. And that's basically how a trebuchet works. On part 4, I tell them to look at this particular page and read the short paragraph called the sling, and then look at the diagram on the bottom of the page. So if we click on the page, I have them read this diagram about the sling that explains the science behind it a little bit more. And you can see the diagram here. Then on part 5, I have them watch a video to see one in action. And I'll
Hugh
show the
Kennedy
beginning
is
of
a
the video.
medieval armor expert. Many years ago, he came across a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci of a machine called a trebuchet for throwing heavy objects like dead horses. Hugh decided to try building one, a quest that led to this piano-flinging contraption.
Pretty cool, huh? But for the sake of time, I'm not going to show you the whole video, but you get the idea. They get to see a trebuchet in practice. So as you can see, I have scaffolded this to show them a picture of it. Then we go through why it was used. Then we talk about the science behind it, and then they actually get to watch a video. So the last thing on the procedure is I'm going to get them to fire one themselves. I found a simulation online, and where they are going to destroy a castle. Assuming my computer works. And you want to allow the shockwave, all the fun with technology, especially when you're trying to film a video. And of course I clicked on the button. Always be patient. Okay, here we go. Okay. So once they get the shockwave installed, they'll get to the point where they can go to this little game here, and it's actually more complicated than it looks. They have to make decisions about, you know, the sling distance, launch pad, sling length, ball weight, counterweight. So I'm just going to pick a couple right here. And if they do it incorrectly and they hit fire, it doesn't work. So they were too close and they got killed, right? So what I have them do is they continue to do this until they get the right combination. And since I've done this before, I know what the right combination is. And if you do that, you knock down the castle.
Well done, mate. Well done.
Yeah, students get a kick out of that. So after they've done all of this, then I take them to the conclusion activity. And again, this is the part where you tie up the inquiry question and get the students to answer it. So I have them think back on their experience as a knight in the Middle Ages. Was it harder than they imagined? Would they consider the knights of the Middle Ages great inventors? One thing that they should have gotten out of this activity is that the scientific spirit that we see today, with all the new technology being created around us, was present thousands of years ago as well. Many people made great sacrifices, often with their lives, in order to make these efficient weapons. Does technology still require sacrifice today? So then I take them to a link that takes them to President Reagan's famous speech after the Challenger explosion.
But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans.
And again, for the purposes of time, I'm not going to show you the whole video. But they can watch the video and then they come back and answer these questions. After listening to what he had to say, do you agree? Were the sacrifices of the astronauts' lives worth the scientific achievement? What about the lives of the knights who worked to make better weapons? Do they compare? So again, we're getting them to think deeper about scientific advancement in the Middle Ages rather than just what does a trebuchet used for. And then finally I have to figure out, did they actually get it? So we go to this evaluation activity. Write a short response, 2 to 3 paragraphs, based on your response to the Webquest. Focus on your experience learning about the trebuchet. Did that information help when you tried to knock down the castle? Also answer the questions posed in the introduction and conclusion of the Webquest. Do you think that the Middle Ages can be considered an era of scientific innovation? That was our inquiry question. Does it matter if the innovation is primarily focused on ways in which to end others' lives? Is technology worth sacrificed even when it means human life? Is there a difference in your opinion on sacrificing on behalf of exploration, like the astronauts, or compared to war, like the knights in the Middle Ages? You'll need to turn this in at the end of the class. Once you've done that, you will have completed your Webquest. So you can see how this overall activity scaffolds to get students to answer these fairly deep questions in a analytical way. So some final considerations about Webquests. All right. As I said before, good content is always better than flashy graphics, but if you can do both, that's great. And when creating a website, have links that move from one step to another, as well as links on each page that take students back to the home page. And make your external links, the ones that go to different websites, open in new windows. That way students won't get lost as they go through the Webquest. So that's a short summary of what good Webquest is. And again, you can use mine as an example, but feel free to be creative in this. The biggest thing that students mess up on when they do this is that they don't have an inquiry question. So I will end again by defining what an inquiry question is and what you're supposed to do with it. So an inquiry question is something that's in your discipline that cannot simply be answered by a Google search. So I'll use the example in history. When did President Truman drop the atomic bombs on Japan? That is not a good inquiry question because simply you could type that in and get an answer in about 10 seconds. An inquiry question would be, should Truman have dropped the atomic bomb on Japan? That's something that doesn't have a clear answer, and you could look at evidence and be compelled to answer that he should have or that he shouldn't have, and either one would be right. Okay, so something in science might be, should evolution be taught in schools? Or, something in language arts could be, based on, should the Hunger Games be considered a realistic depiction of a dystopian society? Something along those lines. Whatever is important and to your discipline. And then again, in the Webquests, it's important to name the inquiry right up front in the introduction and make sure they answer the inquiry at the end. If you do that, it's 90% of the battle. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, but I look forward to seeing your Webquests when they're completed.